Don't sell your house with tenants in it in Ontario until you watch this video first. There is a lot of risk involved if you don't know what you're doing. I'm going to give you the best tips and best strategies on how to sell your house with a tenant in it in Ontario. My name's Daniel Hale. I'm a real estate agent that works with a ton of real estate investors. So I sell a lot of tenanted properties, and I want to share with you what you need to do to make sure you sell it legally and lawfully and you stay out of trouble when you're doing this, because a lot of people make a ton of mistakes and they don't even realize that they're doing it. The Ontario Tenancy Act has a strict requirement that you must follow. So let's talk about these steps and what I recommend to make this an easier process for you. The first one I want to talk about is giving your tenant the proper notice. Now, there's no set requirement on that notice when you are selling a tenanted property, but I always recommend at least give your tenant a heads up and tell them a few weeks before you sell that property as a courtesy to that tenant. They might need to relocate and they're gonna wanna plan, and they might also say to you, you know what, I'll start looking for a new place. You have no idea how they're gonna react. They might not like it, a lot of tenants don't, but when you are selling your property, you do want to give them a little bit of a heads up so that you can coordinate and they can also speak to you if they have any questions. You can also lay out the plan for them and tell them exactly how things are gonna go. The next thing is make sure you know the Ontario Tenancy Act, or better yet, make sure you hire somebody that does. Because when someone's selling your property with a tenant in it, they're heavily responsible for anything that can go wrong and any legal issues that they might cause, because they're the ones selling the property. But the truth is, sadly, if something does go wrong or something's done that's not lawful, it's you, the landlord, that is stuck in a liability situation. So you want to make sure you know the Ontario Tenancy Act when it comes to selling your house, or hire someone that does. Know all of the options that could happen and make sure your tenant is also aware of them. You're negotiating with a lot of buyers and you're also negotiating with the tenant depending on the scenario of who is buying your property. Now let me explain. Now you typically have three options. You have the N11, the N12, and someone who is assuming the tenancy. Now the N11 is an agreement amongst the landlord and the tenant to end the tenancy by a specific date. Now this is something that is used when the landlord and the tenant agree to a cash for keys sum. Unless the tenant agrees to move out or they're already looking to move out, you can get that document signed. But a lot of times tenants are open to working out a cash for keys settlement if they know an investor is looking to buy the property, because an investor cannot buy the property and re-rent it out for more. That's heavily against the Ontario Tenancy Act. But what you can do is have an investor buy the property if the tenant and you agree on a cash for keys sum and you guys both agree to sign an N11 to end the tenancy. This is an agreement, so the tenancy is done and that investor can then buy the property and do whatever he wants with it. Now I've done this a ton of times when selling a property. Sometimes I get the buyer to pay the cash for keys amount. Sometimes I get the buyer and seller to split the cash for keys amount, because they're both coming together to get what they want, which for the landlord is the sale of the property for top dollar, and for the buyer, it's getting the property with vacant possession. And the tenant also gets to walk away with something that assists them with a new place, helps them out, and they're also happy with the sale as well. Everything went good for everyone. That is typically one of the best options. Now the next option is the N12. This is a notice that you're going to give the tenant when somebody is looking to move into the property for their own personal use. If somebody's looking to move into the property for their own personal use, you do have the right to give the tenant an N12 notice of eviction for that reason. Now an important note is the tenant does have the right to a landlord and tenant board hearing if they feel is an unlawful sale. So you need to make sure that you do everything correctly and you have the correct closing date so that you don't get in trouble. Now the last thing is if somebody assumes the tenancy. This is great for you, it's great for the tenant. But the truth is, a lot of times people won't assume the tenancy unless it's at market value rent, or close to, and you have great tenants. If they show up at the property and it's super sloppy, it looks like a mess, it's got signs that you might have like a little bit of a troubled relationship amongst the landlord and the tenant, they might say, I'm willing to buy this property, but I want it vacant so that I can fix up the property and re-rent it myself or do whatever they want with it. So if somebody's gonna buy that property and assume the tenant, if you have a great tenant, market value rent or close to, you will get market value for the property. If you don't, and there's a lot of issues within the house, someone's probably gonna try to lowball you, so you might wanna go another direction and try to work out that N11, that cash for keys, or something that's more advantageous so you can clean up the property, sell it for more, or at least be able to guarantee that vacant possession. Now, the next thing I wanna talk to you guys about is making sure that you understand the correct closing time. That's the completion time when the sale is final and the new purchaser takes over. If you're doing an N12 notice, you cannot give an N12 and have closing with vacant possession unless you give the proper notice. The N12 gives the tenant 60 days notice in order for them to vacate and find a new property. Now, if you give this to the tenant at the inappropriate time or not within that time frame, it's void. You need to make sure that you give it to the tenant before or at the time that they pay rent, because that's when the 60 days starts. Now, when it comes to the N11, the completion date can be whatever you agree upon with the tenant. If they agree with you and you guys do 60 days, 90 days, whatever that is, you want to put the date on the N11 of when the tenancy ends. Now, still make sure you do not close on that exact day, because the truth is the tenant technically has until midnight to make sure that they're out of the property. So if you're closing on the property before the lawyer's office closes, which is typically before 5 p.m., little bit of a pickle. So you want to make sure that you actually close a couple of days after the tenant leaves. This way, you know that you can clean up the property, you know it's vacant, there's no issues, and everything is good. Now remember, just because you gave that tenant 60 days notice on the N12 doesn't mean they have to leave. They do have the right to a hearing if they feel it's unlawful, or they just want to try and kick the ball down the street and stay a little bit longer. You need to make sure that you have the appropriate clauses in the agreement of purchase and sale that allows you, the seller, an extension or enough time to make sure that you can issue vacant possession and not get sued. Never, ever, ever guarantee vacant possession within the 60 days. Always make sure that you have a clause in there that gives you the extension that you might need just in case the tenant doesn't leave and you have to go to a landlord and tenant board hearing. Now, with the assuming of the tenancy, you can close anytime you want. That is now between you, the seller, and the buyer, because the tenant is staying, he's assuming the tenancy, whatever works for them, that's not a problem. Go ahead and let them choose the closing date or what's best for all of you guys. Now, with these directions, you also have to have the appropriate clauses and the appropriate conditions in the sale. If somebody is assuming the tenancy, I'm gonna wanna put it in the agreement of purchase and sale that they are assuming the tenancy. There's no questions asked. On closing date, that's what's happening. If it's an N11, I make sure I have an agreement with the tenant that they've signed the N11 and that's in the agreement of purchase and sale. If it's the N12, your agreement of purchase and sale is going to have a lot more things in it, such as the buyer's buying it for personal use. You're going to issue all the appropriate landlord and tenant board notices. The buyer is going to sign a declaration stating that they are moving in, which releases you and makes sure you're not held liable. There's a lot of things involved in this. And if you're looking for a real estate agent that can help you sell your tenanted property, make sure everything goes smooth, you get top dollar, and you do not get sued, just shoot me an email, send me a text, or give me a call. I'd be happy to help you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.